Hello and welcome to another episode of Disastrous History. This episode is going to be a new adventure for us, as it is one I've never done before, a plane crash. Now, I know many of you have requested plane disasters for a while now, and I've always said I'd get to it eventually. The truth is, flying is one of the things that I absolutely hate more than almost anything. Something about sitting in the back of the plane and seeing the front of the plane move in a completely different direction just makes me cringe internally. And because I used to fly so much for work, I wasn't super keen on learning all the ways it could go catastrophically wrong. But since I no longer travel that much, I figured I would finally tackle a plane disaster. Now, I know many of you are expecting a very well-known one, but surprise, we're going with a lesser-known plane crash, the 1977 Air Indiana Flight 216 crash. Now, before we get into this, we need to discuss the very basics of flight, because in order to understand why a plane comes down, you first need to understand why the plane goes up. I'm a firm believer in you can't explain the failure if you don't understand why it works in the first place. So, the way an airplane achieves flight is obviously through the wings. Everybody knows that. The wings are shaped in that teardrop-esque shape for a specific reason. The top portion of the wing is more rounded off, while the bottom is a flatter shape. The reason for this is as the air hits the front portion of the wing, the air splits in two. So some of it goes over the top, some of it goes under the bottom. The air traveling over the top of the wing is being forced to move faster than the air under the wing. As air moves faster, the pressure drops. Because the air traveling over the top of the wing is moving faster, it creates a low pressure area and subsequently a higher pressure area under the wing. So that air that's going under the wing is at a higher pressure than the air going over the wing, and that creates the lift that puts the plane in the air. As long as the plane is either maintaining speed or gaining speed, lift will keep the plane in the air. If the plane is losing speed, the lift will be decreased and the plane will begin to descend. Now, you can't just slap wings on anything and make it fly. That will make you crash 10 out of 10 times. There are other things that come into play here. There are different parts of the plane. There's the tail, there's the wings themselves, there's the fuselage, there's the center of gravity. All of these things work together to actually make the plane fly. So we're going to start with the center of gravity. Basically, the center of gravity is where in the aircraft the plane would be perfectly balanced if it was suspended in midair. The best way to explain this is if you've ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, this is a weird analogy, but if you've ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean, the very beginning of the Curse of the Black Pearl, Will Turner is bringing a sword to the Admiral and Lieutenant, Admiral Norton and the Governor, not the Lieutenant, I'm sorry, the Governor and Admiral. He pulls out the sword and says the tang is nearly the full width of his blade, and he sticks his finger out and he puts the sword on top of it, and it balances perfectly even on both sides. That is the center of gravity of the sword. It's the same thing with a plane. If you stuck your finger out and you held the plane, it's exactly where the plane would balance on either side so it doesn't fall down, right? Essentially, the center of gravity is the average location of all of the weight located in the aircraft. That means all mass, the fuselage, passengers, luggage, fuel, potential payload, and military aircraft, all of it. The center of gravity also helps determine where your center of lift is. So your center of gravity can obviously move back and forth depending on where the weight is currently in the plane. If you have more passengers in the back of the plane, your center of gravity is going to shift towards the back of the plane. If you have more passengers in the front of the plane, it's going to shift towards the front. If you've got it evenly distributed, it's going to be more centered. That makes sense. Your center of gravity also helps determine where your center of lift is. The center of lift is the location where the lift is created for the plane. This is always located behind the center of gravity. If it's not, things go poorly. You see, with the center of gravity being in front of the center of lift, if there wasn't an empennage, more commonly known as a tail, the plane would immediately go nose down directly into the ground. The tail, as I just said, of the plane has miniature wings on it, or as they're actually called, horizontal stabilizers. These are literally upside down wings. They provide downward force on the plane to prevent the nose from plowing directly into the ground as soon as it lifts up. We've all had paper airplanes that immediately nosedive directly into the ground as soon as they were thrown. That's because there was no downward force acting on the rear of the paper airplane to keep it balanced in the air. These downward stabilizers have a section on the back that moves up and down called the elevators. These are controllable by the pilot in order to point the nose of the plane up or down. If the elevator is lifted upwards, the nose goes up. If the elevator is pointed down, the nose goes down. This is called the pitch of the plane, and it's what helps with ascent and descent. It is essentially controlling the amount of downward force that is being acted upon the tail. And since we've already started, let's go ahead and just talk about the other parts of a plane. Since we're already there, we will just cover the rest of the tail. The triangle in the back that sticks up is called the vertical stabilizer. This prevents the plane from shifting left and right and basically fishtailing like a car that's on ice. On the vertical stabilizer is the rudder. This is used to steer the nose of the plane left and right, which is known as the yaw. Now, this isn't the main way of steering the plane. It's more to prevent drag and make sure the plane isn't fishtailing in the sky. So if the plane starts to fishtail to the left, they'll point it to get it back so it's going straight rather than going back and forth and acting all weird. Now, moving down the fuselage, which is the main body of the plane where everyone sits and everything is carried, we reach the wings. Starting on the inside of the wing, the first portion that moves is the flaps. These are movable and controllable by the pilot and are used to improve the lift of the plane at slower speeds. They are also used to help the aircraft descend faster without gaining airspeed. This is important because if airspeed is gained as the plane descends, landing becomes much more dangerous. Basically, as your plane's going down, it obviously starts to gain speed, right? Because it's moving, it's falling, it's starting to go faster. They put the flaps up to create more drag to help slow it down so that they can descend slow enough that they don't smack the ground and bounce, right? That makes sense. Moving out from that, we have the ailerons. The ailerons are located at the very outside edge of the wing on the back side of the wing, one on each side. They are always opposite each other unless closed, which means if one is pointed up, the other is pointed down. So if you want to turn right in the air, the right aileron will move up. At the same time, the left aileron will move down. This causes the left wing to produce more lift, and the plane will start to roll to the right. This is the main way planes are steered. Then, depending on the aircraft, you have your engines either right next to the fuselage under the wing or on the rear of the tail right next to the vertical stabilizers. All of these are pretty standard on all types of aircraft. Now, that brings us to December of 1977. The plane in question was a Douglas DC-3 plane, which was a propeller-driven aircraft that was incredibly popular for transporting individuals, and by this time in 1977, they were often being used as charter flights. This would be primarily college teams, although there were some others that would use it. That's where we are on December 13th, 1977. The University of Evansville, a small private school in Evansville, Indiana, had chartered Air Indiana Flight 216 to carry their men's basketball team, the Purple Aces, to play a game against the Middle Tennessee Blue Raiders in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Now, usually and historically, the team had traveled by buses to all their away games. But in 1977, something had changed for the University of Evansville. They were now Division I. That meant they were playing with the big schools, the Big Ten, the SEC, those big-time schools. They were now playing for a chance to go to March Madness. So, they were playing with the big-time schools. And the Purple Aces also had a new coach. Their previous coach, who had led them to multiple national championships at the lower level, had retired. So they hired a new coach by the name of Bobby Watson. Bobby was a real popular basketball coach in southern Indiana in the 70s, apparently. And he had decided if they were going to play with the big schools, they should act like a big school. So they began to fly chartered flights to all their away games. The season had started rough for Evansville. They'd played 4 games, going 1-3 in those games. A 10-point loss to Western Kentucky, a 23-point loss to DePaul, a 7-point win over Pitt, and a 26-point loss to number 11 Indiana State, which is not a bad start for Evansville in their first season in Division I, but still not a great start. but they were feeling pretty good headed into the rest of the season. Bobby Watson was a very energetic coach and was a very popular coach, and the players loved him a lot. So they were very excited to see how the rest of their season played, and they were used to winning a lot in Evansville. They'd had multiple national championships in the 70s. They were really good, and that they expected the city of Evansville really embraced the team. Basketball in Indiana is a big deal. If you don't know, basketball in Indiana is more or less a religion. So, especially in the 70s. But at the same time that Evansville was starting their run as a really good lower level school, Indiana University was also dominating and winning a bunch with Bobby Knight. So like basketball in Southern Indiana, basketball in Indiana overall was a big deal. So like the Purple Aces were pretty popular, especially for a small school. Now, the plane, a Douglas DC-3 registered as N51071 and operating as Air Indiana 216, left Indianapolis on a cold, rainy, foggy night at more or less 6 p.m. The flight had been delayed in Indianapolis by 3 full hours because of the conditions at the airport. On board the flight from Indianapolis to Evansville was Jim Stewart, the president of the charter company National Jet Service, and Bill Hartford, the general manager of National Jet Service. The service was only 1 year old, but had already flown 750,000 miles without any accidents whatsoever, which is pretty decent. They provided services to the University of Evansville, Indiana University, and several other colleges throughout the state. The pilot for this flight was Ty Van Pham. He had been on the job 2 months, but was a well-regarded pilot. He was a refugee from Vietnam and had been the personal pilot of South Vietnam's prime minister. He had 9,000 hours of flight time, and much of that flight time was in less than stellar conditions in South Vietnam, as evidenced by the fact that he was a refugee. The co-pilot, Gaston Ruiz, was also a refugee, this time from Cuba. He had 1,000 flight hours at the time of this flight. Now, Van Pham had about 4,600 hours in this particular type of plane, which is pretty good, but Ruiz only had about 80 hours of flight time in a DC-3. By the time they arrived in Evansville, the team was supposed to be in Nashville for the game. This was a big problem. Being late for a charter company is not good. Your whole point is to make it so that they don't have to take commercial flights, which might be delayed for a litany of reasons. So the fact that they are chartering this plane specifically for the team and it is 3 hours late to their game is a major problem. Weather barely being an excuse. The flight landed at Evansville Regional Airport at about 7 p.m. They taxied down the runway to the area in front of Tri-State Aero Inc.'s lounge. Now, if you're wondering what Tri-State is, the 3 states they're talking about is Indiana, Kentucky, and Illinois, because Evansville is literally right there in the very bottom corner of Indiana, smack dab between Illinois, Kentucky, and then sitting in Indiana across the river from Kentucky. Waiting there were 14 Evansville men's basketball team players. 3 seniors, Kevin Kingston, Jod Ed Washington, Marion Anthony Winburn. 2 juniors, Stephen Miller and Brian Taylor. 1 sophomore, Keith Moon. 8 freshmen, Warren Alston, Ray Comandella, Mike Duff, Craig Heckendorn, Michael Joyner, Barney Lewis, Greg Smith, and Mark Siegel. There were 3 student managers, Jeff Bonnert, Mark Kirkpatrick, and Mark Neese. Additionally, there was the University of Evansville business manager, Bob Hudson, University of Evidence comptroller, Charles Scheich, sports information director, Gregory Knipping, and a local radio announcer, Marvin Bates. Then 2 Evansville fans, super fans, Maurice King and Charles Goad, were also aboard. They were local business owners who were big boosters for the program. In fact, only 1 Evansville basketball player was not aboard the plane, freshman David Furr, who was out for the season with an ankle injury and wasn't traveling with the team. Additionally, there were 3 Evansville coaches that were not traveling with the team as well, as they were all out on scouting assignments to do recruiting for the next season. As the flight arrived in front of the lounge, the engines were turned off. The players and coaches were eager to get going. They did not want to be delayed anymore for their game. As the plane is stopped and turned off, a device called gust locks are attached to all maneuverable portions of the wings, otherwise known as the control surfaces. They're basically metal wedges that are designed to fit in the movable parts in the plane body itself. This is the rudder, flaps, ailerons, and elevators. They're all light enough they could move in the wind, and if the wind blows from any direction other than from front to back as though the plane was in flight, it can damage the cables and controls by causing them to torque in different directions than designed. So, like, if they're sitting on the ground and say a big wind gust comes through and blows the rudder out of place, it could cause damage to the cables inside that are controlling the rudder, which obviously causes problems in the flight because you need them to be able to steer, right? That's important. It's possible to steer without it, but not having those is not great, and that would cause even more delays. Now, at National Jet Service, there was a standard operating procedure in place to ensure that the gust locks were installed and give someone responsibility for completing it. The person that was supposed to install them and then uninstall them was the co-pilot, in this case, Gaston Ruiz. He went around to the rear of the plane and installed the gust lock on the rudder there, then went to the right aileron and installed the gust lock there. Since the right and left ailerons are linked mechanically, only one is necessary to be locked at a time. If one can't move, the other one can't move. He specifically did not install the gust locks on the elevator. Why? We don't really know. The crew would have been in a hurry, as a 3-hour delay is a long time to be delayed in a charter service, and they very likely were rushing to get through everything and get back in the air. Literally, as soon as the plane was parked and turned off, the passengers and their baggage were loaded onto the flight. Within literal minutes, the flight touched down at 7 p.m. The plane requested clearance from ground control to taxi at 7:12 p.m. 12 minutes to get to the lounge, park the plane, turn it off, get the passengers on the plane, load the baggage, turn the plane on again. They were moving. But speed isn't always a good thing. Speed makes sloppy, and sloppy means mistakes. And the first mistake was already in the process of being made. You see, the passengers had about 623 pounds of luggage, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot, but it's not nothing. Now, a formula is calculated to figure out where exactly to place luggage in the forward baggage compartment and the aft baggage compartment to help make sure the center of gravity is in a good location. I didn't fully explain this earlier, but if the center of gravity is too close to the front of the plane, it will go straight into the ground. If the center of gravity is to the back of the plane, too far to the back of the plane, it will go straight up in the air. It is imperative that it is properly, the plane is properly weighted throughout so that the center of gravity is in a good spot so the plane can lift up and not go foop or go straight into the ground. Either way is bad news bears. Now, on Flight 216, the forward baggage compartment should have had the majority of the luggage, about 500 pounds or so. The remaining 123 pounds should have been in the aft baggage compartment. This was not how it was done. The majority of the luggage was placed in the aft baggage compartment. Only a couple duffel bags with clothes in it were placed in the forward baggage compartment. This shifted the center of gravity for the plane almost to the legal limit when you factor in where all the passengers were sitting in the plane. But the pilots didn't know that. That is important to remember. Pilots did not know. The pilots and the crew climbed back aboard the plane and closed the door ready for takeoff. They requested clearance to taxi at 7:12 and 17 seconds p.m. and received it at 7:12 and 41 seconds p.m. to taxi to runway 18. They did this so quickly, they rushed through most of the pre-flight checklists and completely skipped doing the routine control checks. They had been on the ground all of 12 minutes. How much could go wrong in 12 minutes? It turns out, all of it. Remember how First Officer Ruiz had installed those gust locks on the ailerons and the rudder? Turns out he never took them off. And they didn't know he never took them off because they didn't do the pre-flight check to make sure everything was working properly. If you've ever flown and looked out the window just before you back away from the terminal or as you're taxiing to the runway, you'll see the pilots moving all the flaps and whatnot on the wings. That is to make sure they are all working properly and nothing is still locked down. Flight 216 didn't do that as they were going to take off. They just assumed, since the plane had literally been flying 720 seconds earlier. How much could go wrong in 720 seconds? They barely had enough time to go to the bathroom as they were landing. They were moving so quickly. Indiana Air Flight 216 reached runway 18 and were cleared for takeoff at 7:20 p.m. They began their takeoff down the runway. Everything started fine. Then the plane began to lift off the ground, which most of the time is a good thing, right? We want planes to fly. They're supposed to go in the air. That's the whole point of a plane. The problem here was the plane was lifting off well before it reached the proper speed to actually maintain flight. That's because the center of gravity had shifted so far backwards. The plane needed to reach about 84 knots to maintain speed in the air. It took off at about 65 knots. This is a problem. Now, this particular part is difficult to explain, but follow along with me here. So, at the proper takeoff speed, an increase in power from the engines will make the plane go faster and have more lift, allowing it to climb into the sky properly, right? That makes sense. You provide more power, the wind going over the top of the plane creates a lower pressure, creates more pressure underneath the wing, lifts up in the air, goes faster. That makes complete sense, right? But if you go below that takeoff speed, the angle of attack of the plane has to increase in order to keep the plane lifting. Now, I haven't explained angle of attack yet. Angle of attack is the angle at which the plane is to the airflow. So if the air is flowing parallel to the ground, the plane is at an angle up into it. That is the angle of attack. So if it's going straight parallel, it is a parallel angle of attack. At lower speeds, it has to lift the nose up some so that it has more lift up from the air going over the top, and it makes it create lift that way. To explain this a little bit better, everyone has been in a car, and you've rolled the window down and you stuck your hand out the window. You have it running parallel to the ground, and you can feel the wind going around it, and it's smooth sailing. It's moving, it's cutting through the air. It's like a plane, right? Your hand is flat to the ground, parallel, it's moving just fine. Now, as you angle your hand up, your hand goes flying backwards, right? Like, all of that air is now hitting the flat part of your hand. It goes flying backwards, and you slam your arm back into the back of the window. You have increased the angle of attack of your hand and increased the lift on your hand, right? Because it starts to go up a little bit, but you've also increased the drag and slowed your hand down. Now, it doesn't really slow down because you're in a car that's moving, but your hand goes backwards because it's moving slower than the vehicle. When you have it flat with the vehicle, it's going the same speed as the vehicle. But if you've lifted up, it technically, for a split second, is going slower than the vehicle because you've increased the amount of surface area that now has exposure to the wind. So it flings it backwards and it increases that angle of attack. It creates lift, but it also increases drag and makes it more difficult to maintain speed. A plane is the same thing. If we go back to our plane here, as you are lifting your angle of attack up, you are increasing drag, which is slowing your plane down. You need to increase the power being put into the engines in order to maintain that speed and fight off that drag while also creating lift. If you don't add power, the speed will drop, the plane will stall as the angle of attack increases even more, and you will fall out of the sky. This can be compensated for if you know it is going to happen. Unfortunately, Captain Van Pham did not know this was going to happen. And it didn't matter because Captain Van Pham was likely distracted at this point by something else that in the moment was probably way more terrifying. The fact that the rudder and the ailerons were not responding to his control at all because the gust locks were still in place. You know, the things that turned the plane. Immediately after the plane took off, ground control cleared Air Indiana to departure control. 3 seconds later, First Officer Ruiz replied, "Stand by." That was the last transmission received from anyone aboard Air Indiana Flight 216. Now, at this point, Captain Van Pham probably knew that he was in a bit of a pickle. His plane is going straight up, he cannot steer. The way to fix the plane launching itself skyward and gain some speed and therefore be able to fix the too slow problem is to dip the nose towards the ground and gain speed that way. So he's got to back the engines off, allow the plane to tip towards the ground and go towards the ground to gain speed that way, and then lift up to go more, right? Problem was, the plane was only about 300 feet off the ground. There was no room to gain speed and pull up without meeting the ground unceremoniously, which is never good for a plane. But in addition to this, there was another problem. Now at this point, witnesses on the ground say the plane took off, went into a steep climb before banking to the left and disappearing into a cloud. This left turn was the issue. The rudders and aileron were both stuck in place, meaning the only way to fix this left turn was turning off the right engine and applying extra power to the left engine, or turning off the left engine and applying extra power to the right engine. Meaning, you've got to apply more power to one side to be able to turn the other direction, right? That's like steering a boat. You got to put the paddle on one side. You put the paddle on the right side, you're going to go to the left. You put the paddle on the left side, you're going to go to the right, right? Makes sense. Now, based on witness accounts, this is what the captain tried to do. He took off, was going into that steep upward, realized that he couldn't turn, and then according to witness statements, it sounded like the engines were fighting each other. One was less powerful, one was more powerful, and it appears that with that left bank into the cloud, he was attempting to head towards runway 22, which was to his left and was angled off back towards the airport. Problem was, he's at this steep angle, and as he's turning, he's losing more speed because he needs both engines applying power to keep the plane in the air. Turning off the right engine or turning off the left engine in order to do that left turn means not having enough power to maintain altitude and break that drag, thereby increasing the drag and increasing the chance for a stall. The pilots and all 27 others aboard were stuck in a doomed situation. The plane was coming down no matter what the pilots did. At this point, once they entered that left turn, there was nothing they could do. Really, once they entered that steep climb and they couldn't get any higher and they started to make that turn, they were hosed. They were too close to the ground to gain speed to keep it in the air. He did the only thing that he probably could do, and it probably wasn't going to matter. Indiana Flight 216 emerged from the cloud in a downward motion before clipping the top of some trees next to a housing development just next to the runway, turning into a right bank, then corkscrewing nose first directly into the ground on the edge of a ravine. The time of the crash was 7:22 p.m. and 22 seconds. Air Indiana Flight 216 was in the air for approximately 2 minutes and 22 seconds. Upon impact, the fuselage ripped open and flung baggage, debris, and passengers still strapped into their seats across the ground and into the ravine. The fuel immediately ignited and caused a large fireball to erupt through the area. Back in the air traffic control tower, one of the individuals working there yelled, "Oh, he's crashed." The Evansville Fire Department was immediately dispatched to the site, but there was a problem. It was cold, foggy, and raining. Even with the flames burning in the debris, no one could find the crash site. Eventually, someone did. The first people on site were the residents of the Melody Hills housing development the plane had just missed. They climbed through the mud and rain and fog to find several passengers in the ravine. Most were dead, but 4 were miraculously still alive. They attempted to provide first aid, but it was too late for 3 of them. They died before being transported to the hospital. Only one individual survived the initial crash to make it to the hospital, freshman player Greg Smith. He made it to the hospital and survived 5 hours before eventually succumbing to his injuries. It would take approximately 10 more minutes for the fire crews and rescuers to make it to the site. So the people that lived in the housing development, it took about 10 minutes to get there. Fire department took about 20 minutes from the moment of the crash to make it to the site. Fire engines became trapped in mud, so firefighters had to go on foot. At one point, one of the police officers who had found the site could hear rescuers but couldn't see them, and they also couldn't see him, so he fired his service weapon into the air to help find the place. That's how foggy it was, and dark, as it was nighttime. But in all honesty, there wasn't much anyone could do. Everyone who arrived quickly realized this wasn't a rescue mission, this was a recovery mission. But no one at the site knew who was on the plane. That is until one of the rescuers found a duffel bag belonging to one of the players with the purple and gold Evansville Purple Aces logo on it. He exclaimed out into the darkness, rain, and fog, "Oh my God, it's the Aces." The entire Evansville Purple Aces men's basketball team died that cold, rainy, foggy night in December 1977. That night, rescuers were able to recover every body except 3. Captain Van Pham, First Officer Ruiz, and National Jet Service owner Jim Stewart. They were stuck in the cockpit, which was buried beneath all the debris after it plowed nose first into the ground. Now, one of the interesting things with this recovery effort was there was no road that led to this crash site. It was a good distance from anywhere. But there was a train track that went right through that ravine. So, at some point, someone got together a locomotive, a single train car, and a caboose, and they loaded all of the players, the coach, and the 2 boosters onto the train car, stuck a red road flare on it, and it blew its long horn as it carried all of the bodies off to the temporary morgue they had set up. Many of their rescuers said that the sight of that red road flare on that train and that long blown whistle would be one of the things that would live with them forever after that night. Now, you have to remember, this was 1977. There were no cell phones. There was no internet. The family members of those aboard had thought they'd left 3 hours earlier. Literally almost no one knew that the flight was delayed. Basically everyone thought that the flight had left on time, and as the rumors of a plane crash spread through the city of Evansville, they just thought it was some plane. It was first reported that it was an incoming plane that crashed, not an outgoing plane. So there was a lot of confusion as to what exactly and who exactly was aboard the plane. Until phones started ringing. Jeff Neese, the brother of the student athletic trainer aboard the flight, was at a local high school basketball game when the rumors that the plane carrying the Aces had crashed. He wasn't too concerned, though, thinking the flight had left hours ago. He continued on his night as normal and went to hang out at a local McDonald's after the basketball game, because teenagers haven't changed at all since the 70s. There, another student told him that the Evansville plane had crashed. He decided to go home because he was unsure what was true. He didn't know if it was actually the basketball team or if it was just another plane, and whoever told him that was wrong. When he arrived home to an empty house and the phone constantly ringing, he knew it was true. The news of the crash had quickly spread through the town, and everyone knew who was aboard the plane. It caused massive grief through the community and the small school. Now, an investigation was performed on this particular crash. The cause of the crash was officially human error, the incorrect baggage storage and the gust locks remaining in place. The fact is, if either of these had been the problem alone, we wouldn't be here talking about this. If it was only the baggage, Captain Pham could have fixed that. Like, if it was only the center of gravity being too far back, he could have fixed that. He could have yanked back, been able to maintain that power, and get to a high enough level that they would then be able to go down and gain speed and go back up and be able to have a normal flight. It would have taken a little bit, but they would have been fine. If it had just been the gust locks in place, they would have been able to get to a good speed and then use differential power in the engines to be able to turn and land back at Evansville, take the gust locks off, have a normal flight, right? But the two combined together was just too much to overcome, and it led to the deaths of all 29 people aboard Air Indiana Flight 216. Now, after the investigation was complete, there wasn't really anything that anybody learned in particular for this particular disaster. Like, it wasn't a thing that they just didn't know. Like, it was very obvious that the gust locks being in place was bad. That had happened before. It was very obvious that the center of gravity being too far back was bad. That had happened before. The one thing that they recommended, the National Transportation Safety Board recommended to the FAA, was that they require that airport rescue vehicles be able to go off road, because one of the big issues was that no one arrived at the crash site for 10 minutes. When you are trauma, 10 minutes is a long time to wait, because it's 10 minutes to get there, and then they have to triage you, figure out what's going on. They have to find you once you get there with you still alive, because those people are going to be unconscious. So getting there, finding them, applying first aid, and then getting them to a hospital. You're talking a 15, maybe 20-minute delay at that point, simply because they could not get to the crash site because of how muddy it was. So the National Transportation Safety Board recommended that all airport vehicles be able to go off-road. The FAA rejected that and decided that they didn't need to do that. They decided that the access roads they have all the way around airports was more than enough. Don't know that I agree with that one, but whatever. It ended up being that the Evansville airport paved the access road around the outside of the airport, and they additionally bought vehicles that could go off-road, because obviously they don't want this to happen again. So that was pretty much the only thing that really came out of it that changed, or should have changed, and ended up changing in the future, because most airports now have vehicles, emergency vehicles, that can go off road. That's kind of standard across the board. Now, the president of the University of Evansville, Wallace Graves, really stepped up in the aftermath of this disaster to lead the university in its time of greatest tragedy. He was one of the first people to find out on the night of the disaster that it was the Evansville men's basketball team. Like, obviously, he's president of the university. He went around and, told people this was the men's basketball team. He and his wife attended every funeral for every person aboard the plane, no matter where in the country they came from. He also directed the university to pay for every funeral for all of the victims, and offered all surviving siblings, children, and widows a full scholarship to the university, redeemable for their entire lives, which several took advantage of. They did use the scholarship. Some of them didn't, which can't really blame them, but some of them did, and that is an incredibly generous thing he did. Now, the university briefly considered continuing the 1977 season with athletes from other sports, but decided against it in the end and canceled the rest of the 1977 season. Now, I said that the entire men's basketball team died in the plane crash, which is true. The entire active men's basketball team died in the plane crash. But I did mention at the beginning that there was one player who was not aboard the plane at the time. Freshman David Furr. He was out for the season with an ankle injury and obviously was not traveling with the team. In an incredibly cruel twist of fate, 2 weeks after the plane crash, literally 2 weeks after the plane crash, David Furr and his brother were killed in a car accident in Illinois. Officially, the entire 1977 Evansville Purple Aces men's basketball team was dead. The entire team. The very next year, with the help of the NCAA waiving the transfer rule that required athletes to sit out a year, the Purple Aces fielded an entire new men's basketball team coached by Dick Walters. That 1978 team struggled out of the gate, losing their first 5 games. But on December 11th, 1978, almost exactly 1 year after the accident, the Purple Aces won their first game since the accident, a 59-58 victory over Morehead State at Morehead. The team would end up going 13-19 that season, but by 1982, Evansville had booked its first trip to March Madness. Now, this plane crash left a lasting mark on the school. A memorial was placed on the campus that honors all 29 people who died in the crash and David Furr, who died 2 weeks later. It is an orb shaped fountain in the middle of the campus known as the Weeping Basketball. It's literally an orb shape. It has a bunch of points on it, and the water comes out and it falls down in the shape of an orb, and it looks just like a basketball. It also sits in the middle of a brick, I, almost like a brick cone, almost looks like a basketball goal. Looks like a basketball falling into a basketball goal. It is incredibly touching. Outside the fountain, there are two stone slabs. The one on the left reads, "In memory of those gallant and devoted men who gave everything they had, even life itself, to the sport and to the university they loved." On the right is a portion of the speech President Graves gave to the mourners who gathered in the gymnasium after the disaster. I'm going to read it entirely because it is something that is deeply touching, and I think it's a fitting end to this episode. "Out of the agony of this hour we will rise. Out of the ashes of a desiccated dream we shall build a new basketball team, stronger, more valiant than ever before." And with that, we have reached the end of this week's episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. As always, you can follow me on all social medias. If you want, you can join my Patreon. It's patreon.com/disastroushistory. I enjoy you guys immensely. I also have YouTube video. This is on video. It'll have pictures with it that will go right here. It's edited by my loving and adoring wife. She does a great job. So if you want to see me do arm motions and explain things with my hand as we go through everything, then you can. And you want to see pictures with the crash and all of that, you can see it on YouTube. It is also disastrous history. So, as always, stay safe. Remember to check your smoke detector batteries.